You are joining us for Volunteer Engagement, Reclaiming Community Roots with our special guest, Sue Carter-Kale of Volunteer Commons. What we'll cover today, we'll explore volunteer engagement by discussing the limitations of current volunteer management models that are adapted from practices designed for paid employees. We'll talk about community-based models that are more inclusive of purpose and relationship. And we'll also discuss practices you can implement in your organization's volunteerism. Make sure to stay tuned to the end, where we will also discuss what the research has shown about connections in volunteer engagement, applying gift economy principles to volunteerism. I'm really excited about that discussion, and also positive outcomes for community-based models. All right, let's dive in. So what does it really mean to root volunteer engagement in the community? Where does this concept come from, Sue?
Yes. So um, I think of this not so much as a definition, but really an ethos about how we want to engage with the community and be in community with each other. For me, when I think about getting back to community, which is really the roots of most of our organizations, some, of course, are still all volunteer organizations, but most of us, even that have multi-million-dollar budgets, started out as all volunteer organizations. So this is about remembering the values that got started, about reciprocity, about interdependence, about care, about love and stewardship. And it kind of moves us out of the default that we sometimes find ourselves, which can put us into focusing on logistics and getting kind of caught up in a transactional interaction with the community and or our volunteers. So this gets us back into the things that really inspired the work in the first place and can still be important to infuse through the work on a day-to-day basis.
That's amazing. Will you tell us a little bit about your specific experience and your work and sort of how you got started with this? What is Volunteer Commons? What is all of this work you're doing?
Yes. So this really came out of the experience that I had. I worked at a number of nonprofits in a variety of roles before landing at a volunteer center, which was one of the best roles that I had. But as I was kind of had this bird's eye view into the community, one of the things I was just noticing more disconnects. So I was noticing, for example, a disconnect between the ways that people talked about their service or the ways that organizations talked about their volunteers, about how meaningful the partnerships were, about what it enabled them to do because they were partnered with the community. And the ways, and so there was a disconnect between that and the ways that we were reporting it, so what you see in an annual report or what you see sometimes on the website, which was defaulting to, we have this many volunteers who serve this many hours at this, and sometimes we hang that price tag on it. This was the financial value of that. So that was one of the disconnects that I began to see. And also, really, as I was kind of peeling back the layers to this, seeing that, what was happening in an attempt to professionalize the sector and make sure that we could be organized and engage people well and not waste their time, that we drew on a lot of business practices that actually came from resources, which is not bad in and of itself. It's just that the kinds of things we do with employees aren't always the same kinds of things we do with volunteers. And so recognizing that we needed to also be mindful of what volunteers were looking for and needing, because they weren't typically looking for something that felt like work on top of all of the other kinds of paid roles and unpaid work that they were already doing in the community. And so that's really kind of what got me interested to say, okay, well, if this was informing our work, this is just one way of doing the work. What are some of the other ways that are out there? And that's part of my research. Then in a way, I sort of stumbled across gift economy and then further into the commons and just saw all of this language and framework for a different way of being that really seemed to reflect better the kind of work that happened in volunteerism.
That's amazing. So when you are talking a little bit about that, we've got this slide here. We've got time and money, which is really interesting because I think we all think about that all the time. It's something that I think is on our minds a lot, as far as resources. So is this a little bit of what sort of prompted that community-based research?
Mm-hmm. You know, when I when I would ask people what was most meaningful about their service, no one was ever leading with, well, I served 243 hours last year. They were telling me about the connections that they made. They were telling me about how important it was, if this was a community they had been part of and had received a lot from, that they were contributing back to. They talked about the relationships they made along the way, about being able to express their values, about being able to contribute skills or networks or connections. And so I was really said, well, the kinds of things we're seeing, in the traditional volunteer management cycle aren't really inclusive of that kind of language that I'm hearing, of those kinds of experiences. And so that's where I just sort of put up my antenna for, what else we might find along the way. And as it turned out, I read a book called Braiding Sweetgrass by Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, that I know a lot of people are familiar with. And she talked a bit about, I mean, a lot of it is community, but she talked about gift economy. And that's kind of was the seed that planted. And then I went down a whole rabbit hole there and read The Gift by Lewis Hyde, which is a much deeper dive, but was really quite fascinating too. And just that was sort of my entree into, okay, here's something that might be something else for us to latch onto.
That's amazing. So then what was it that you really started to find,
Mhm.
and also love braiding sweetgrass? So
Yes, yes. So I think there was yes, somebody already got that braiding sweetgrass for the question in the comments. Um, and maybe we can go on to the next piece of the next slide, because I think that kind of gets at one of them. What it helped me do when I looked at some of the gift economy research is to start comparing and contrasting it to market economy, or the kinds of things that we see day in and day out that really drive so much of our society, but also it drives a lot of our nonprofits. And so this idea in a market economy about value that really prioritizes numbers. It prioritizes counting things, about quantifying things, about pricing things, even when they're difficult to price. Whereas in a gift economy, if we kind of add on to that piece, there was this notion of worth, and worth was inclusive of the counting, the numbers, the prices, but it also started to infuse things like sentimentality, about tradition, about history, about meaning and purpose. And so this idea that worth kind of was this bigger, more inclusive concept for me. And if we kind of go on to the next one, I'll just kind of share it. So my husband was a little league coach, and this is one of the baseballs at the end of the year that the kids all from the team all signed. You can see Kayla and Quinn right there. But the baseball itself is probably worth about $5. But when you add all the kids' signatures, and getting, and sort of this memory of the fun they had, the skills they learned, coming together as a team, the worth of this baseball far exceeds $5, right? Because it's got all of the things that were packed into that volunteer experience that were part of it. And so I love this notion from the gift economy of worth, because it seemed to me that this is where we can start bringing in those things like meaning and purpose that really are motivating so much of volunteerism. If we go to the next slide, we can also talk about some of the things about connection. So in a market economy, if I go down to the store, I can buy a loaf of bread and I hand over my money, I go home, and I don't have to have a relationship with the checker, right? I'm not in a relationship with the people who farm the ingredients or who baked the bread. I just take the bread and go home. So it's more transactional. There's a sense of independence, there's freedom. I don't have to have an ongoing connection. Whereas in a gift economy, it's about exchange is a different kind of situation. So that we might be exchange. If you think about the exchanges that you have with your friends or your family around gifts, or just when you see something just perfect for someone in the store, what that does, that exchange is actually building the relationship. It's creating a sense of interdependence. And it reinforces a sense of responsibility to each other, not necessarily for each other, but it really says, okay, this is a relationship that I've invested in, and I'm giving some piece of myself along with whatever, tangible item that we might have shared. And so this idea of connection seemed to really be a better fit for volunteerism too, where people are showing up, and they don't always want a deep relationship with the organization or the role, but they are looking to say, a lot of people are coming to this saying, I want to be part of my community and I want to take responsibility for my role in community. And so it seems to me that that's a real reflection of a better reflection of what the connection can look like when we cultivate it. And then just to highlight another piece from the research in terms of status, that in a market economy, a lot of times it's about, status comes from owning things, about possessing things, whereas in a gift economy, the value is on really stewardship and sharing. And that again seemed to be more about, this isn't about hoarding my time or even my resources, the other kinds of monetary resources I have, but really how do we show up for and with each other to pool all of the resources that we have and to see about how, how does our community, how can we get to our community to move forward? How can we thrive together when we share all of those resources? So those
Yeah.
were just kind of, that's a little bit of the nerdy side, but it seemed to really get into, something that was a better reflection of the volunteer experience.
Yeah, and Sue, I really appreciate too that contrast of kind of considering value and worth, because I think that sometimes when we look at these things like, market or gift or value and worth, it can feel very either or. And I really appreciate that depth of saying it can include just more, like worth can
Mhm.
include more than just the number. Because it feels like maybe what was found in the research was that the number just really wasn't enough to really be descriptive of the actual connection, the actual relationship um, that was really taking place between volunteers and organizations, causes, communities. Also, this word of status is really interesting to me in general, because I guess for me that word is, I don't know if it's intriguing to anybody else, but what does it mean in kind of context of a relationship in general? So I really appreciate this word also, stewardship, which I think comes up a lot in volunteer engagement.
Mhm, mhm. And and I think it kind of gets at that sense of we can talk about managing volunteers, but I think when we think about our work in terms of stewarding a community, that just kind of shifts things in a really meaningful way for us.
I think this is an interesting one too that comes up quite often, that it's kind of how do you move mindset from ownership to stewardship? And I think the example you often get is kind of the corporate volunteer, where they're giving this and they're giving this and this is what they're giving and it's very defined. Whereas you really want to change the relationship to be a relationship that has sharing on both sides and dialogue. Are you seeing, and I think that's where we're headed in this conversation, but I think that status piece, I'm sure the audience is thinking about, like, how do you step into that? Like, this is if it's one side and I want it to be the other side, moving it that way is a big challenge that's the challenge, I think, in my.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that probably, while it might be nice to think about the world in terms of a gift economy, that's not the world we live in. And it's not the priorities typically are more on the left side of these slides. And so I don't want to minimize the real tension that there is between some of these concepts, because I think it is real. And so I think some of the things that some of the things that we can do then are not, there's such a focus on numbers, how do we kind of counterbalance that? So some of the things I think are, bringing things in like our values. So when we start to say, okay, yes, the numbers are important, but, we have an organization value of care or community or about being present to the people we serve. And so I think when we start to look either at official values or maybe sometimes our unofficial values, maybe they're not written down and hung up on the wall, but those kinds of themes that come up over and over about how we do our work, not just how much of our work we do, I think that's one way to say, okay, so I hear there's an emphasis on, say, these numbers, but I'm concerned if we have that many volunteers, they won't have a meaningful experience, for example. Or I hear that this corporate partner that we really hope will give us money, wants to serve on a day that we're not open, and wants to be in direct contact with people who we need to protect their confidentiality and their dignity. And so our values are the kinds of things to say, okay, we hear that you're interested in this. We really value and we have prioritized client confidentiality, for example. And so here are the kinds of ways that we can engage you. And what that does is it says we are very strategic, and we are just as much about expressing our values as we are about achieving the needs of you. I think the other piece then is that can help maybe counterbalance is saying, yes, corporate people with lots of power and money, you are one part of an ecosystem. You're not the sun. And so, how do we take the resources that you have, blend that with the expertise and resources that the nonprofit has, and highlight and emphasize the strengths and the assets of the community so that we can pool all of those things to bring them together? And so, that may be talking about mission, that may be talking about how are we ensure, if we had to pick one group out of that, how are we ensuring we meet the needs of those closest to the mission and making sure that we're prioritizing those? And a lot of times it's not a yes, no kind of thing. It may be no to this particular kind of opportunity, but we have these kinds of opportunities instead that can meet your needs as well as our client needs or as well as our family needs. And so those are just a couple ways that I'm hearing a lot of my partners and colleagues using as a way to reframe the conversations so that they can be healthy for everyone involved.
I love that. I was about to say that what you're hitting on, I think it was Rosie from Chicago Cares was sharing with us, like there's a power of saying no, but you showed us just then like the nice way to say no. Like you don't want to say no and stop the conversation because it's a critical partnership. So how do you reset the conversation to have a different tone to it? I love what you did there. So thank you.
Yeah, additionally to that, it to me, like thinking about that conversation helps kind of navigate that tension between market and gift in the sense of like, market might be more, only numbers or dollars driven, but you can say kind of like a, yes, I see that. And there are other kinds of community stewardship considerations that we have to take into account that are that actually and I think having that conversation that may hold some tension can actually create a richer relationship. And I know we were chatting about this the other day about the fact that like, community is actually really, it takes effort, it takes showing up. And there's like a level of it's going to take something from me. Like there's no relationship that I have in my life that doesn't require something of me as far as my showing up.
Hmm. Right. And I think that what it helps us do then is shift away from, sometimes corporate volunteering, it's framed as a win-win-win, but it's actually extractive of the nonprofit and the communities. And the pictures we see of corporate volunteering, or really any kind of group volunteering, of the happy people in their matching T-shirts with lots of people in one place, that doesn't necessarily work for everyone. And so, helping people shift from what this image of the thing that shows up on social media isn't the only way to serve, isn't necessarily the best, the deepest impact, or even the healthiest impact. And so, there's a lot. I appreciate there's a ton of education that goes on with that, but I think that's one of the things that it can do to help make your nonprofit really set apart to say, you know what, we are prioritizing community and we're looking for partners who are willing to do that too. So when you're ready to do that, we're here. In the meantime, here's what we can accommodate, or maybe it's just not yet.
And so tell us a little bit about this view here. What is kind of this metaphor of the mountains and the meadow really mean in the context of this conversation?
Mhm. So the other research that I somewhat stumbled into and have been fascinated along the way is really about notions from the commons. So a lot of times we think traditionally about the commons as a pasture, right? And if we're all in the village and we come, graze our sheep in the same pasture, and how do we make sure that we're not overgrazing it? And there's this really great article by the late Jeff Brudney and Lucas Mace, who talk about the commons of volunteer energy. And what would it look like if we thought about volunteer energy as a commons that we collectively steward across the community, not just in our organizations, but across all of the organizations who might be engaging volunteers. And so there's a really great article. It's an academic thing, so it's firewalled, but I kind of do an overview of it in more layman's terms on my website, but it's just a couple highlights that I think are really valuable to borrow from the commons. So one of the definitions that a commons is a resource, a community, and the protocols that help the community manage a particular resource. So really and it can be anything from not just a pasture, but it could be our professional associations. So for example, if your local volunteer association or Dovia or AVA or Alive, or the communities of practice that Galaxy Digital has been cultivating. So I think one of the things is, how do we think about if we, for example, steward volunteer energy, if we take care of that volunteer energy in our own organizations, then those people who have had a good experience may continue with us, and they're probably going to go on to volunteer in other kinds of ways. If we are extractive, if we exploit people, if we burn them out and just kind of use them up because, hey, there's lots of volunteers out there, we'll just get more, then we're going to deplete the overall resource for the community. And so again, there's some kind of nerdy academic thoughts on this for those who like that sort of thing. But I think there's some real applicable, so then we talk about how are we I think also about the terms we use. We've kind of shifted from volunteer management to volunteer engagement more recently. I think I don't really like to be managed, but I do like to be engaged. And so this idea of, how does the language we use, how do our practices, how do we really take a look at how and who we're engaging in the community, who we're not engaging in the community, that those are all practices of stewardship that will contribute. And I know so many organizations are struggling with recruiting. So what are the things that we're doing that can help people feel like this is somewhere I want to be, and they've equipped me to be successful, and I will come back to this over and over again.
So why is volunteer engagement and kind of like this mindset shift, why does it present perhaps unique challenges that are maybe just a little bit different if you're sort of looking through this lens of gift economy versus market or commons and shared resources? What's really coming up there? I think probably people in the chat could have a lot to say.
Yes, and I would love to. I'm trying to keep an eye, but I can't. It's a little hard because it's moving quickly. There's lots of good stuff going on. I think first and foremost is that our society is really built around these concepts that prioritize quantification, pricing, transactions. And I think that a lot of our organizations are structured around how do we serve those with power and resources. And so it can be really difficult. And again, I don't want to minimize this because those challenges are very real. And so I think that, this emphasis on, if we say, okay, well, we want to emphasize relationships, we want to emphasize community, that takes time. And everyone, they're not everyone, but there's a real scarcity of time that seems to be getting kind of deeper, year in and year out. And so, how do we say this is important? Because this investment is not just about taking care of our volunteers, it's about taking care of our volunteers so that we can take care of our mission. Yes, it takes time. Yes, it takes effort, but those are all investments into what we're trying to achieve. And we can't achieve our mission with only paid staff. I think one of the other challenges is that it starts to shift power. When you think about kind of HR practices, they're sort of top down one way. And if we want to really engage community, what that does is it kind of shifts the power differential to say, we don't have all the answers at our organization, but we collectively as a community have the answers. And how can we ask for your opinion, ask for your feedback? I know Adam James and I were just having a little exchange on LinkedIn this morning about, feedback loops and cultivating conversation as a way to say, we really are in community here. We're not just holding you volunteers at arm's length and telling you what to do. because we've got all the answers and expertise here. So I think those are some of the challenges that the way we've typically done things really kind of holds power at the organization, and engaging the community more fully means that we have to let go of some of that power.
And I
Just
think, oh, go ahead, Elizabeth.
yeah,
You
I was
saw.
saying, coming up a little bit in the chat here, Sue. I'd love to post this over to you because there's that part of a lot of government funding, a lot of foundation funding has very strictly defined metrics. It's hours, it's quantities. And I think part of what we've been hearing through different series is it's not, the old adage throwing out the baby with the bathwater, but it's that part of like maintaining the structure you have to have, but starting to add to it some of these qualitative measurements so that impact can be expressed as the third question on the form or the fourth question on the form or tracked over time. Well, I'd love your take on that. I had one presenter telling us that it's not so much that funders don't care about that. They just also, those are the numbers they've been ingrained to ask for. So sometimes in your proposal for funding, if you're starting to bring in different ways that you're also going to measure the impact, they're open to that as long as you're still hitting the consistency of what their funding requirements do have to mandate. Just curious to speak a little bit to that because there's a lot of that happening over here on the side.
Yes, I actually wrote a whole dissertation on it, which I will save you the depth of that. But kind of two things. One was that in the dissertation, as well as some more recent research that I did with the Initiative for Strategic Volunteer Engagement, it turns out that funders have a far greater appetite for more than numbers and hours and financial value than we've kind of given them credit for. And like you said, Elizabeth, they don't know what else, right? We're the folks who know what else. I think another way, and there's lots of folks I've noticed just in the chat who are also experts in this, but kind of one of the things that we've done is we've taken, in this push for data, it's kind of, that game Jacks where you just kind of like flung everything on the ground. That's kind of what we do with our data points sometimes, right? And they're just all over the place. We haven't told a story with that. And so even just even if we don't collect anything new, but we start to say, and I think we had a comment earlier that volunteers are an input. Absolutely. We had this many volunteers partner with our staff to serve this many hours. And as a result, they served this many clients. They this many dogs in our shelter. This many, they helped clean up this many miles of beach coastline, for example. And that helped us do X related to our mission. Or perhaps you might tell a story. Courtney's one of our long-term volunteers here at the farm. And here, I tell you about Courtney's story, what she's achieved, what it's meant to us because of Courtney's service. And she's just one of 100 volunteers who are helping us produce, make sure that there is fresh produce to go around to seniors who don't have it. I'm just making those kinds of details up. But you can see what that does here is it now takes sort of the Jack's approach and takes just data, and it starts to weave it into information and knowledge. And the quilt actually becomes kind of a good metaphor here, right? So if we think about a quilt, just quilt squares, if I just give you all the individual squares, that's not a very useful blanket. It doesn't keep you warm or make you feel comforted. But when we start to weave these things together, and when we start to reintegrate the things that have been fragmented, because that's one of the other functions of market. We can't solve really big, complex things, so we break it down into small things, but then we don't weave it back together. And so I think that's kind of, not to pull too many pieces in together, but I think just to kind of do this. One, let's link our volunteer numbers to our organizational outputs and or outcomes. Let's weave together our qualitative and our quantitative data. And let's tell a story with that so that it looks like our volunteers aren't just the side thing we have because we're a nonprofit or government agency and we have to, but rather they are part of the team that accomplishes the mission on our behalf.
Well, there's some fun stuff happening. I think there's a Sue dissertation book club starting, so that's really exciting. I see happening in the chat. But I feel like a lot of what you're saying and what I'm seeing folks mention in the chat is really reminding me of my friends who do improv, because it's
Mm,
all about yes and like it's like,
right.
okay, this, but keep it going, keep the momentum going. And then what's fun about that is you create something collectively together. And I feel like that's maybe a little bit of kind of the vibe I'm getting, is that there's just so much more to the story, and that if we offer more, like, yes, I'll give you this number, but let me tell you like what the real deal is, because there's so much more. We get this really beautiful, rich, meaningful, and anybody who's ever had a handmade blanket knows the meaning behind that. It's it's just it's just got a richness and a depth to it and a meaning that goes beyond the value of the fabric, and turns into that worth that you were explaining to us earlier.
And if you
Um,
want to chat about the dissertation, which is like, oh, I sometimes look back on it and cringe a little bit. Like we can have that conversation about where I am now, because it's come a long way because of the additional conversations. So I'll just put that pin in that.
I was going to say that yes and is attractive to me too, Court, because I think that piece of, just as Sue said, you have to start the conversation, you have to start the relationship. And I think a yes and lets you brainstorm to second, third, fourth, 2 year out, 3 year out planning engagement, so that you're not getting stuck in, I can't do what I really need for my nonprofit in this one conversation, but we're yes anding our way toward the future. So maybe this first one's not exactly what I want, but I've got more time and control on the second engagement, and we're going to do something really special and measurable by the time we hit year 2. I think that's just a great tactical way to build relationship, because it takes time. It's not solved in one, meeting where everybody comes together and they suddenly realize all the things that they misunderstood through all the years. It takes time. So I just want to encourage you all not to think short term, think long term. Think, how do we get past the first relationship building stepping stone to a stepping stone, so that we're stepping to the next one, and building a quilt square by square. We'll pull the analogy back in.
So let's talk
Yes.
a little bit about this. How do we start to kind of shift from some of this maybe more traditional sort of, employee-based model versus community-based model? Would that be a good way of saying this?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And again, I think, there are lots of useful aspects, to be able to look at how do we take care of our volunteers in a thoughtful way, so that we're not wasting their time, right? We want to steward time, our own and theirs. So there can be some value on the left-hand side, but I really liked sort of the reimagining that happened. So I have a reference here in terms of from Boomer Volunteer Engagement. They created some, and then I just basically inserted the things in quote or in parentheses that came from gift and commons theory. And I think the idea here is, again, how do we shift this from being a one-way top-down kind of approach to something that's a little bit more community-based? And I think that, again, people aren't necessarily looking for something that feels like a job, which the left side of the column can do that. Instead, how are we engaging community? And now, if you've got a one-time beach cleanup, I don't expect that you're going to sit down and have a full negotiation of what the role would look like and how we do it and all of those kinds of things. But rather, when you look overall at the kinds of ways you're engaging the community, if all you've been doing as an environmental organization, for example, is doing beach cleanups, maybe there's a way to start to incorporate advocacy, for example. What are people learning from what they're picking up on the beach? And how might they help advocate on behalf of the organization to look at different policies, or to talk about other ways that we're doing cleanup, or ways that we're preventing so much trash from getting to the beach in the first place. And so I think that's kind of that these are big picture things on the right hand side. And as we were mentioning, like you said, Elizabeth, at the top of the hour, we've got so many different missions that are here on this call, that we couldn't possibly come up with, here are the 10-point plan that you need. So I don't think about best practices so much as guiding principles. And so how are these perhaps guiding principles for the ways how we want to do our work? in addition to the specific practices that we do our work.
And do you find, Sue, too, that, having guiding principle is more like just a lens for someone to look through as far as, really embracing the nuance of your organization, your cause, your volunteer community, like the community at large, because, the fabric of every community is reflective of the people that make it up, and the values might be a bit different. And so I think, that way of sort of navigating the nuance really does empower the individual community versus saying there's this list of things that you should do, and I'm kind of curious about how some of those conversations evolve, because that, it feels like sometimes I feel like, just please tell me what to do. Like, like I think all of us
Yeah,
have plenty on our plate. So at the end of the day, we're like, I just want to know like what, 30 minutes of what is gonna like make such and such better. And I think like a formula can feel like a relief, whereas like,
absolutely.
it might not actually be applicable. And so it
Mhm,
feels like
mhm.
there's, some room for evolving conversation here, I suppose is where I'm getting at.
Yes. Well, and there's some other research that Mark Hager and also Jeff Brudney did, and they were looking at best practices in volunteer management, and they found that that it didn't make sense for every organization to do all of those practices at the same level. So, for example, if you're Girl Scouts or CASA or some other organization where you've got adults coming in and working with kids, especially CASAs who might be working with very vulnerable kids, you can't just take anybody off the street and say, "Great, have at." That's a whole different kind of thing than if you're doing tree plantings or beach cleanup kinds of things. And so, the kind of risk management you need for CASAs is different than you might have a different kind of risk management because we're using power tools if we're doing cleanup and wildfire or even just tree planting, right? And so, what I thought was great about that is that it really honored that we talk about volunteering like it's this monolith, right? That it's this one thing, but it's all over the place. And so their research really found that there's not one way to do it. There's lots of different ways to do it. And what's important is, like you said, Courtney, it's all about finding what works for your context at this point in your life cycle with the kinds of volunteer roles that you have and the kinds of volunteers who have been partnered with you, as well as the kind of staff that you have, right? The expertise and training that they have too. So, what I think is that, guiding principles and these concepts, then, how do you marry? You're the expert in your organization, or you and your team are. So, how do you kind of take these concepts, apply it, like you said, we're going to look through these to our specific context and then figure out what makes sense for us right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. All right. So this is a lot of big topics, but let's like talk about these lenses a little bit more and what are these, guiding principles that we can utilize in the uniqueness of our organizations and the fabric of our communities.
Mhm. So the first one, and we've talked a bit about it already, is to reclaim purpose. So why does our organization exist in the first place, and why do we involve volunteers in the first place? If I gave you all the money in the world, this is one of the questions I'll often ask: would you still engage volunteers in your work? And for most organizations, the answer is still yes. And the specific answers they give, because this helps us bring the community into the organization and bring our mission out into the community, or because we need people to really, because we can't solve homelessness on our own. We need people to help understand what the face of homelessness is, what policies are influenced, and all of those kinds of things. So, getting back to our purpose about why we exist as an organization, why we involve volunteers, and then our values, those can all really help us to infuse community back into that. And so I think part of this is, how do we own the parts of our work that are hard to count, but are really important to the kinds of things that we do? So again, I think when we're starting to look at okay, so we may have to report to AmeriCorps or some other peak body, for example, some numbers, but we can arrange those numbers in a way, or maybe if we have an open comment section, we can talk about what those numbers mean to our agency, why those numbers are good or bad, or what we're trying to do, so that those folks are really helping us meet our purpose, that they're not just this extra thing that actually detracts from our purpose, because it takes a lot of effort and time and investment to engage community. So that's just one piece.
I'm like, really, I love that question of, if you had all the money in the world at your organization, would you still engage volunteers? And the fact that it was majority like yes, that's really meaningful to hear that. So yeah.
Yeah. And if the answer is no, and you're doing this as a team, that's a really important conversation to have too. Because if the feeling is no, and we're just carrying on like volunteers are the answer to everything, we're gonna really come up with some difficulties in the agency. And so it's helpful, like, let's just get that out on the table and talk about that. This next one, uh, I've come across this notion of right relationship in a few different ways. And it's hard to define, but I think when we've been in right relationship, we know it. When we've not been in right relationship, we know that too. And so what I think about is our organizations are often structured so that we're in right relationship with funders, but we haven't always asked the question, are we in right relationship with the people closest to the mission? Are we in right relationship with their loved ones? And so again, when we're thinking about the kinds of data we collect, that's a values choice. Are those the kind of data that would matter to the people closest to the mission, who might be worried about more, are you treating me with dignity rather than how many volunteers did you have in the first place? And I think another way to think about right relationship is, are we doing with the community? Are we getting proximate with the community rather doing to the community or for them, because we've come up, kind of with this noblesse oblige, or kind of this patriarchal idea about we know best. And so, just an example of this was an organization where they had a lot of wealthy donors who like to come in and volunteer with the preschool kids. And it threw off the whole day for the teachers and for the kids. And frankly, nobody had ever asked the parents of those kids if they were okay with strangers coming in to read to them. So the organization was actually going through a training and saying, look, you need to prioritize the people closest to the mission. So they went back to the wealthy donors and said, we'd love to have you volunteer, but it makes more sense in our senior meal service program rather than with our preschool kids who really need routine and familiar faces. And it was well received. So people kind of shifted in that. So that's just one example of how one organization said, we want to really put this idea of right relationship into practice.
I really like this one. I was telling you, Sue, the other day that I was had just recently been in a class where the concept of radical welcome came up. So I was excited to see this in your slide deck, and I definitely want to hear more about what that means for volunteerism at your organization.
So I borrowed this concept from Stephanie Spellers, who's a priest in the Episcopal Church. And she wrote a whole book about it. It's called Radical Welcome. I've actually got it on the shelf right here. But I love the ideas that she had. Radical welcome as when the voices, presence, and power of many groups are heard and valued. And again, she's doing this from a religious context, but as I read through, I was just like, oh, this is just about engaging community. And so one of the questions that she asked, or two of the questions that just kind of stopped me in my tracks every time, is who is not at the table, and who would never come to our table because they're so sure we wouldn't welcome them because historically we haven't. And so I think this idea about, a lot of people are asking, how do we diversify our volunteer corps? How do we get people who aren't like us into the organization? But they haven't done the internal work of saying, in what ways are we welcoming people, and who feels most welcome in our organization? There may be a reason that our volunteer corps is quite homogenous, because the welcome we extend really is appealing to people from a particular demographic or background or lived experience. And so I think when, how do we make this practical? Starting to look at what kind of language do we use to talk about the work that we're doing? What kind of images? Are we framing volunteering as this thing that you do because we're taking pity on our neighbors or those people, or we have to help them, and it kind of becomes this sort of guilt motivated sort of thing, instead of seeing communities as having strengths, and as being whole already, and that we can come into community with them, and that it's not just we're going to come change you so your lives are better, but we're going to show up and be willing and ready to change, based on what you say you need and what has already been successful. And so I think that how do we there's a great quote that Dana Litwin, who's a consultant, uses: every interaction with our agency is an invitation to stay or an invitation to leave. And so how do we start to look through those interactions to say, is this welcoming, and to whom is it welcoming? And maybe there are steps or barriers that aren't even necessary right now. We got rid of an awful lot of things during lockdowns. Some of us just kind of went back to the way we did it, but perhaps there's an opportunity to think critically about which things are really necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. It feels like the design is how we can create the welcome, and that does take a lot of, reflection. So talk to us a little bit about what sharing power can look like, can feel like, um, in our organizations.
Yes. So it's always an interesting thing to use the word power in a volunteer engagement space, because there's often a lot of hand wringing about how much power we don't have or how much power we perceive we don't have. But I like to define power as influence and decision making, just as one way to think about it. And when you think about how many decisions you make day in and day out, in volunteer engagement, you in fact do have some power of some way, shape, and form. And so that may be determining, who is giving a training, who's at the front of the room, what goes into that training, what kinds of requirements are required to be a volunteer, what does your application process look like, who is honored as a volunteer, as outstanding volunteers or good volunteers, who is qualified to be a volunteer. So these are just examples of all the decisions that we have. And in many cases, we've kind of made them unilaterally, on the organization side. And so this may be an opportunity. Again, I appreciate that this could be a very time intensive process, but looking at what are the ways, for example, in one organization, they put together an ad hoc committee that had volunteers, board members, and staff on it to look at some of their volunteer practices. So they designed a volunteer survey, for example, and then they analyzed the results as a group. And so, having all of those insights and observations helped them come up with a plan about how they wanted to engage volunteers better. They came up with new roles for volunteers. They actually shifted some of the functions, some of the tasks from paid staff to volunteer leaders who had been there a long time and had an enormous expertise. And it turned out that it was such a valuable kind of experience that they shifted it from an ad hoc to a permanent committee, because it was so useful. And they could basically that was the place that any volunteer issues came up, we went to this group. And so it's been a really enriching kind of experience, and a way to share power. So it's not just on the organization side, but really saying, how are we pulling in from all of the audiences that we have?
That really reminds me of what you mentioned earlier about the table. So it sounds like they brought everyone to the table and were able to have a really rich conversation that led to some positive quilt making, if you will.
Yes.
And then what's next here with our free bird?
Yeah. So I think that a lot of us have gone to trainings for many, many years, and have been told this is how we do volunteer engagement. And in fact, sometimes that's on the mark, right? I've given a lot of those trainings, but sometimes we just need to let go of some of the practices that aren't serving us anymore. And so part of it may be just taking a pause and looking, what kinds of practices do we have in place? Who are they welcoming? In what ways are we sharing power or hoarding power? In what ways are we engaging the community as partners rather than these people we're just telling what to do? And if there are beliefs that are getting in the way, if there are practices that are getting in the way, is it stop doing something, not to just keep adding to our to-do list? So I think that there's a piece there. I think that sometimes the kinds of limiting beliefs I come across, so for example, an organization I was working with, they said, we had this belief that volunteers could kind of only do what they were told, but we had, some of our volunteers had been there years and years and years. And so they let go of the belief of volunteers kind of as, people who are outside the organization, and they took some of those long-term volunteers and invited them into leadership roles. They started thinking of them as strategic partners, and so that mind shift allowed them to go, oh my gosh, these are people with enormous experience and depth of expertise. And it turned out when they gave them more responsibility that the volunteers were ready to accept, um, the results were phenomenal. They were able to achieve so much more. The volunteers felt so much more invested. They felt like they were really part of the organization, and they didn't feel like they were kind of other. They felt like they were part of the team. And so I think that that's just one example of how letting go of a belief about what volunteers can or can't do helped, get them out of the way. And then just on a personal note, I think, when I share this stuff, it's nice, but I realize that what everybody who's talking in the chat here, is up against. And so it kind of feels like sometimes this might be too big of an ask. But frankly, I think this is the work that's ahead of us. And it really is one of our callings to figure out how do we make this work so that we don't just dissolve into a bunch of transactions and logistics, because that's not what community is about. And we've never needed community more than we do now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, a lot of what the huge shifts that have already happened in our culture, in our communities in the past 5 years reflect how much these conversations are needed. And so thank you for acknowledging that. And also, it does feel like it is in many ways, the way through is the way forward, if you will.
Right.
So definitely, we're kind of coming up here in the next 5 minutes to the next top of the hour. And, just want to give you some things. We're going to send out the recording. We're going to send out all of these bonus resources. Sue also made a really great worksheet that it really kind of concisely puts a lot of the concepts that we've talked about today. So you'll be able to download that when we send it out to you Tuesday. And then, maybe take some time to check in with the processes like Sue was mentioning, and what the way that the volunteer engagement process is designed. Do you need background checks, or do you only need it for some roles? Things like that. And then explore opportunities to employ maybe some more community-based models. You can definitely refer back to some of these slides and watch the recording of this. Of course, read Volunteer Commons. I think there's a dissertation book club starting soon. And I have these conversations with, each other, with your organizations, with your communities, and see what comes of it. And of course, we want to say thank you, and so grateful that Sue was able to join us and be with all of us today. We're so grateful to continue to host this innovative approaches to volunteer leadership series here at Get Connected, and love having you all connect with us. I think we've got like 2 minutes if we want to take at least one question before we log off for the day. Is there, AK, Shauna, is there any question that we'd need to address? I think the chat's moving too fast for me to keep up with.
We had so many great conversations in there. I know we've got this whole book club situation going. I just wanted to plug the blog. I mean, there's so much on there and so much out there. I think there's a lot of resources within this network as well. So it sounds like there's some connections going. So that's great. Great to hear. Thanks for coming.
Absolutely. Please do connect with each other, and we definitely want to keep seeing you all show up here for this series. We've got Nicole R. Smith coming next month, June 27th, and some of you may know her podcast from the suggestion box. So we're gonna have a really dynamic conversation then, and talking about, you know, how do we craft solutions and inspire change. And so I think it'll be a really great way to kind of keep the conversation going that we've had today as well. AK or Shana, you could drop that link in the chat so folks can start to sign up for that experience as well. Any closing words, Sue, that you want to leave the group with today?
Thanks for having me, and thanks for the chat. I can't wait to check out the chat afterwards, because it looked like there was lots of juicy stuff happening there. So thank you to all of you for doing this work day in and day out, because you're really unleashing so much of what is good in our community, and I'm very grateful for that.
Just chime in to second that. And it's Court and I always were saying the time is our most valuable resource at times, and you just spend it with us. So thank you so very much for being here. And I think it just attests to everyone here is trying to figure it out. They're talking, you're building relationships, you're thinking about it. You're going to try it again and try it again to find what's in common. Because I love that. That's my nugget from today. What's of worth? What's of worth that I see as having worth and the people I'm talking to have worth? How do we then work on it together? So yeah, thank you, Sue. That was very inspirational. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. We've got some great ideas coming in too for more events to host with volunteer leaders. Well, again, I'll just say thanks to Sue Carter-Kale for joining us today. You can learn more about Sue's work at volunteercommons.com and check out all the amazing links. We're going to send you on Tuesday, May 28th. You're going to get the recording. You're going to get Sue's worksheet. You're going to get a bunch of bonus resources that we mentioned to you, as well as the chat and a certificate of attendance as well, if you would like to use that for your CVA. And again, who are we? We're Get Connected by Galaxy Digital, and we make up a network of over 50,000 nonprofits and over 2 million volunteers. We do create volunteer management software solutions for every type of organization, program size, and budget. So if you're in need of that, reach out to us to learn more. We would be happy to chat with you. And we hope to see you again in June. So take care, and thank you for being with us today. See you, everyone. Thank you so much. Thanks, Kathy. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, AK. Thank you, Shana. And thank you, Sue. I will talk to you soon. Okay.
Sounds good. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. This was fun.
It was an absolute joy. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye,
You
everyone.
too.